moment today will be given by Rick Robison. Rick is a native son of Utah, attending Brighton High School and BYU. He trained in optometry at UC Berkeley, big fan of nature and the outdoors, and loves traveling, hiking, biking, karaoke, and good food, drink, and conversation. He and his wife of 8 years, Cheryl, live in Bluffdale. Rick knows a few things about a few things and has a lot of wisdom to offer our community. Please welcome Rick.
Well, you know, the old saying, some people know a lot of things about a few things and, a few things about a lot of things, or a few, however that goes. Well, I know a little bit about a lot of things, but not a lot about any one thing, so I guess that's how we'll say it. What? Surprise, that's it. So, what? Oh, except for eyes. Well, I know a lot about the eyes. There we go. My wife's going to correct me through the talk, so I told her to do that. So I want to apologize up front about my spiritual journey. I mean, it is what I have, but it's a Mormon spiritual journey. So I thought I'd just ask up front, because I'll kind of adjust my jargon accordingly. How many here have a Mormon background? Okay, so there's a good few that don't. So I'll explain all of the like TBM and things like that I'll talk about through my journey here. But I was born and raised in this valley. I went to Brighton High School, as you mentioned. In my senior year, I was the Salt Lake Valley South Seminary president. Seminary is, for those that aren't Mormon raised, is a release time that is offered in junior high and high school where you can go to a class and learn about the church or have church education. And I was the seminary president, so I was about as TBM. TBM is true believing Mormon or true blue Mormon, depending on how you define it. And I was about as TBM as you get through high school. The church was my life, and I was raised with the kind of typical in the 70s where there was a real. It was very apparent that those that were happy and successful were the Mormons. And if you were not a Mormon, you just, you were out in the parking lot smoking whatever and doing whatever. And, that's just how it was back then. And so, I kind of observed that I needed to stay the way that I was to be happy. So after high school, I went to one semester at BYU. And then I was called to go on a mission to Japan, in the southern part of Japan, the Kobe mission. And I loved Kobe, I loved Japan, but there was something that happened right away. The first week or so of doing my work in Kobe, I observed something that was my first cog dis. We call it cognitive dissonance. This, you have this perception of what's going to happen in life, and then something is different than that, and it just really throws you for a loop. So my first cog dis was that the Japanese were happy people. They were moral, ethical, happy, helpful people. And that didn't make any sense to me, because not only were they not Mormon, they weren't even Christian. How could you be moral and happy without the gospel? And that was really strange to me. I mean, it probably sounds strange to you to think that, but that was very strange to me, because I thought that happiness came from being a Mormon. And these people weren't even Christian, most of them. So it was very unique, very strange. But I kind of worked through that, because, the idea of saying, well, I don't really know what about this, and if I really have a testimony. Testimony is the conviction that we have for, Mormonism. And we're taught from an early age to testify of our conviction for the truth, for the faith. And I did that like everybody else, and I made it through. And towards the end of my mission, I mean, I loved my mission. I loved the Japanese people, and I did well. Kind of stuffed the whole cog dis thing and dealt with that later, I guess. But I came home, and kind of a typical Mormon directive is that you get married within a year. And I knew I had a lot of years of school ahead of me because I was going into optometry. My dad is an optometrist, and he had a practice that was doing well, and it only made sense for me to do that. So I thought, I don't really want to marry right away, but all of my friends wanted to, they said, well, we need to get married right away because that's what we do as Mormons. So we went to all these dances and just tried to meet people, and sure enough, I met my future wife, and we dated a couple times, and we got engaged and got married 4.5 months later. So I was a typical Mormon, marry within a year sort of person. And, I because we were up here, I ended up finishing my undergraduate years at the University of Utah. Go Utes. No? Okay. And as I was going along, I knew my plans. My dad had gone to school down in Southern California at the optometry school that was part of USC at the time. And I figured that's probably where I was going to go. And I applied to the 3 schools on the coast. And I was fortunate with my entrance exam. I took that Kaplan course and got really good scores. And I ended up getting accepted at Berkeley, at UC Berkeley. And nobody from Utah had been accepted there. So it was very surprising to me, but it turned out it was a good school, but it was also a cheap school because the way that the scholarship program worked was Utah paid for my out-of-state fees, and I just paid the in-state fees. So I went to Berkeley. That was a little bit of a shock to my system, living in Berkeley, going from Salt Lake City to Berkeley, California. If you don't know, Berkeley's kind of liberal, a little bit on the left side, and I was, good old Mormon Republican. That was before the Tea Party, but if there was a Tea Party, I would have been a Tea Party Mormon, right? So I loved Berkeley. It was very different. Just what was important to them had not been important to me, and then I learned to be a little more concerned about the environment and about social issues that I'd never really even thought about, here. But even Berkeley Ward was pretty liberal. I remember one time when the bishop read the message from the first president. He said, women should not work outside the home. And he read the whole letter, and I thought, okay, that's normal. And then he says, this doesn't apply to us here. And I thought, whoa, this is pretty liberal. This is pretty different. But I loved it. I actually loved it. And of course, that kind of led to future cogdis. So I finished my training there and returned home and joined my dad in practice. And he'd had a pretty successful practice. It was the beginning of managed care and other vision plans that were cutting your fees and all of this. We grew a multi-office practice called iCare Utah here in the Valley, and it was pretty successful, but also with managed care and everything, our profits were cut. So I had to worked a lot of hours and worked really hard, and that was kind of good. I buried myself in all of that. But going along, we lived in a fairly old ward, and fairly early on, I got called to be I'd been, some of the normal callings, elders, quorum president, and so forth. I got called to be the first counselor in the bishopric. And this was a little surprising to me. I was 35 years old, and I was a bishop in a fairly old ward in Cottonwood Heights. And, it was, I thought, well, I can't really turn this down. I'm really busy, but I can't really turn it down because that's what you do as a Mormon. You accept the callings, right? So I did, and, we're going through this. And, I'd had a lot of shelf items. You know what shelf means? We have these little questions about the church. Well, that's really weird. Joseph would really, marry a 14-year-old girl? I don't understand that, but, I'll put it on the shelf. I'll figure it out once I become a church leader or figure, something will happen. I'll have this dream and it'll explain it all to me. And so, getting into the bishopric, and then about 6 months into that, the bishop of our ward had an accident. He was in the reserves, and he had an accident and was laid up for a few months. So I became the acting bishop in that ward. And that was pretty shocking to me, but I still had to do what I needed to do. And I learned the first couple of weeks some of the administrative processes in the church, and they really, really took me for a loop. There was some abuse that was happening in the ward, and I really hadn't seen that before. And I talked to the stake president, and basically he said, well, yeah, we trust these men because they've been church leaders, they're the priesthood holders, and we don't really trust the women. And it was a little bit over the top for me. I really had a problem with it. But I just thought, okay, what are we going to do? The next day, just coincidentally, I had a patient in my practice that asked if I wanted to participate in a study group where somebody that was using the facilities in his law practice was writing a book about the origins of Mormonism. And I thought, this is just really strange. I really want to look into this. This is kind of interesting. So for the next 9 months, I studied with Grant Palmer as he was writing his book, Insider's View of Mormon Origins. And, Grant's a brilliant man, and he'd been in the church education system, and, we trusted. And they opened the vaults so that there was more information given to him and others about origins that really hadn't been available. And of course, most of the things that he talked to us about, I was totally shocked. I hadn't read any of those anti-Mormon books that had talked about them, but so it just really surprised me. And frankly, within about a month of these meetings every week, I kind of learned that I didn't believe in the truth claims of the church anymore. But here I was, a committed Mormon in my lifestyle, and it was not easy with 4 kids and a very TBM wife, and how to deal with this. But it was very difficult to live every day kind of a dual life. There was a part of me that understood what was going on in the church and was starting to see where this really all came from, and another part of me that had to live the Mormon life. So it was a dual life, and it was a challenge. I took up racquetball. I'd played racquetball before, but I decided to really do it because I found if I was really exercising a lot, I could kind of deal with it. But I was struggling with sleep and everything else, all the other discouragement and hopelessness that you get when you learn about that challenge. And frankly, without really believing in the moral foundation of the foundation of the church telling me what I should do, I didn't really know what was right or wrong or this or that. I ended up with an injury on my elbow and went in for some treatment. And with the treatment came with some pain medication. The pain medication that was prescribed was typical and appropriate for what I'd had. But I found after the first time I took this combination of some pain meds that life was okay. And it not only killed the physical pain, but it killed the emotional pain that I was dealing with. And literally the first day I was taking the pain medication, I thought, this is how I'm going to deal with this, cog dis. I'm just going to keep taking these pills. Obviously, the prescription ran out, as it typically does. But I'm an optometrist. I could prescribe medications. So I just learned, at the time especially, because the pain meds that I had were something you could call in. So I would call them in and get more medication for me. This went on for a couple of years. I knew I was addicted. I knew I was dependent on the medication. But I also thought, without the medication, I didn't have any hope, so I just kept taking them. Well, calling in your own prescriptions is considered forgery, and the licensing board doesn't like that very much. So once I got caught by a pharmacist that was kind of, understanding what was going on, I got arrested and began the process of treatment and recovery. It was no fun. It was a surprise to most people, including my wife. She had no idea. And it was the beginning of the end and the end of the beginning, beginning of the new life. And through that process, I learned I had to be honest. Recovery from drugs, recovery from addiction involves honesty. Now, honesty, as I had understood it, was something that the church taught. So it wasn't a big deal to me because the church wasn't being honest, so what did that even mean? But I had plenty of good counselors that said, no, honesty is about you, what's important to you, how you become healthy, how you deal with your life. You can't be playing this two-life, say one thing, believe another. So that process led to having to disclose to my wife, who didn't know everything about what I had believed, what I had come to believe. And so I told her, and this didn't work for her. We spent years of counseling and trying to deal with the issues. in the end, we had a good marriage counselor that said, write down the things that are important to each of you. And so we did, and he looked at what she wrote. She says, I need a husband that will take me to the temple, take me to the church, take me to the celestial kingdom. And mine was, I need a wife that will allow me the freedom to explore my new spiritual journey, do a little hiking, because I found that I was more spiritual when I was hiking in the mountains. And he looked up at us and he says, you guys need to get a divorce. So we did. And that was the beginning of this new phase. And it frankly was freeing. Divorce is always challenging. There are always issues. But I had 4 beautiful kids that were supportive, and I had, something to live for, and it began a new life. I went through a bankruptcy, had loss of license for a while. Through that process of recovery down in southern Utah, as I was working in a wilderness program, I learned that that my new life was not going to include religion. And so I had to, the house of cards had been flattened, and I was rebuilding it, and I learned the things that were important. My children were important. It was important to spend time in nature. These were all important things. And it was great, but it was tough as a convicted felon to get a job. And I found that the one job I could get was to be a drug and alcohol counselor. So I got my license to do that, and did that for the number of years that I didn't have my license. So I worked in a few rehab centers and learned more about addiction, more about what's going on, particularly in Utah, because all of them were here in Utah. And I've learned quite a bit about that and dealt with that. And the one thing that I learned through that process, and I'm just going to mention this as a teaser, because we're going to talk about this a little more in depth on the 14th of August. Put it on your calendar. Is addiction, as unique as it is, each drug is a little bit different, and there's a physical dependence, but there's always an emotional component to addiction. And what happens in addiction is the person is very hopeless in his or her life. And that hopelessness leads to finding behaviors that will give them relief from that hopelessness. Think about that, because we all probably take some sort of substance, whether it's, we have a glass of wine, or whether it's, we like to gamble or play Pokemon or whatever we do. We have behaviors that allow us some relief or some pleasure. And the real key is that if we have enough hope and purpose in life, those behaviors or chemicals, they can be a temporary thing and we can move on. We don't have to be dependent on them. But what happens is that when you are so hopeless in everything you do in your whole life, that when you start with those behaviors or those chemicals and they give you relief from that, you're going to continue. And continuing in that process is what really causes the addiction. So you can imagine this community when so many people have a background in religion that learn to find their purpose in life in external sources. They have to please somebody, please their parents, please their bishop, please their God, please their whoever it is out there. And until you learn to really focus on what is important inside and what works for each individual person, you will continue in that addiction. Recovery processes, 12-step and so forth, are all part of finding that. But in the end, people don't get clean and sober until they've learned who they are. And we'll talk more about that on the 14th. So I was fortunate to meet my lovely wife, Cheryl, after coming back from a lot of things in the wilderness, and we've been married. We've been together for 10 years, and we both, between the two of us, 11. Oh, she says 11. Phew. Leave it to the wife to correct me. Anyway, so we're loving this third phase of life. We have 8 grandchildren between the two of us, and just love it. And I want to bear my testimony. I know the Oasis Church is. Oh, never mind. Anyway, thanks everybody.